I apologise if anybody went to the meeting earlier in the year in London. These slides are very similar to those, but I have updated them slightly. So I'm going to give you the current overview of where we are with MRSA and C.Difficile. And in general, this is a big success story. So a lot of the data I'll be showing you is from the mandatory HDI surveillance of MRSA and C.Difficile infection. These infections were made mandatory because they were seen as key important infections that the government wanted to see significant reductions in. So here you can see, the laser pointer is not very good. Oh well. You can see over time we started with an aggregate collection of just Staph aureus bacteremia counts, and over time the surveillance programs have evolved to provide much more detail. So they went to a case level so that each infection is a line in the database rather than simple counts, and that lets you then see the data in much more granulation, which you'll see later. And then CDiff was added later on. We've had various changes to the processes, like the introduction of the post-infection review for MRSA bacteremias, which I will also go into detail later on. And also here you can see we've had glycopeptide-resistant enterococcal surveillance, but that was only ever quarterly, and that has now ceased to be mandatory. So if we look over time, this slide really is to demonstrate the increase we saw in MRSA in the early 90s. So if you look on the left-hand side of the chart there, you can see that large increase in MRSA and to a degree MSSA as well within the 90s, reaching a peak in 2001, 2002, 2003 or so, which is where around about when the government started to bring on board mandatory surveillance. So you can see the Staph aureus bacteremia broken down by MSSA, MRSA, and the various introductions to the surveillance program, and also the targets that were used to bring to bear against MRSA bacteremia. So in 2003-2004, there was a national target for a 50% reduction in MRSA. MRSA is the red line you can see there on the bottom. So we had around about 7,000 odd cases a year. We ended up doing enhanced surveillance. There were a secondary set of objectives released in 2010, whereby individual trusts were given targets rather than a national objective. And then we had the introduction of MSSA surveillance, and then the PIR for MRSA cases as well, the post-infection review. So you can see there the large declines we saw in MRSA. They're quite evident on that graph. And you can also see we did see some reductions in MSSA, the blue line, although obviously in recent years we've also seen some increases there. In terms of national strategies, well, we had some national calls for intervention strategies, but individual trusts apply bundles of interventions as they see fit, and they do tend to do numerous interventions at the same time. So it's difficult to tell exactly which bundles were successful, but here's some of the national ones. So there was introduction of line-related bundles in 2003. We had a Clean Your Hands campaign in 2004, and there's been subsequent calls for that. And then specifically targeting MRSA, in November 2006, we had screening of elective patients. And then in 2009, we started screening all patients. You can see those national interventions against the decline of MRSA there. And what we've seen over time is that MRSA has changed from being mostly a hospital onset infection to a community onset infection. So you would consider community onset infections to be the green part of the chart here. So those patients that manifest with their MRSA bacteremia within the first 2 days. So you can see from 2007 to 2015-16 that green area has become much bigger. So there's been a shift away from the hospital setting to the community setting for MRSA bacteremia. And that kind of makes sense because a lot of the interventions were hospital-based. We've seen the source of MRSA bacteremia change as well. So in 2007, when MRSA was mostly a hospital-related onset infection, we saw that the majority of the underlying source of the bacteremia was thought to be intravenous lines. And then over time, that has switched to skin and soft tissue. Skin and soft tissue being a source of bacteremia much more associated with the community setting as well. And obviously, with the line-related care, you had those line-related care bundles coming in as well, directly attacking the bacteremias that were caused by line association. In 2013, we started the post-infection review, and this was in part a way to try and get more sort of community involvement in the review of the MRSA cases. So as we saw, MRSA is changing to a community onset infection, and the post-infection review process is a process by which the acute trust providing care for the patient and the CCG that is responsible for commissioning care for the patient review the case to see if any of the care of the patient could have been better. And the organisation that leads that review is based on the onset of the infection. So for all the community onset infections, so those infections starting within the community or within the first two days of a patient admission are being led by the CCG. However, how does this compare with when you just use the simple 2-day rule? So in terms of how the cases are broken up, pretty much the trust assignment process compared to the trust apportionment process is giving similar numbers. So we did some typing of our MRSA bacteremia isolates back in 2014. It was presented at ECMID at 2015. So previously, MRSA bacteremias in England were caused by predominantly, 90% of the time, 2 strains, epidemic MRSA 15 and epidemic MRSA 16, which is clonal complex 30 and 22. So that was back when we saw the peak of MRSA. These 2 strains were causing around about 90% of all our MRSA bacteremias. And over time, that's come down. So you can see this data from 2014, presented in 2015, and now we're seeing fewer infections caused by E16 and E15. In fact, we actually saw E16 start to decline prior to the large declines we saw in MRSA in general, which actually means that epidemic 15 was the strain causing the vast majority of our MRSA, and these were strains associated with healthcare as well. We did a similar look at the strain typing of MRSA bacteremia back in 2007, and when we did that, we didn't see any Panton-Valentine leukocidin producing MRSA, which can be associated with poor patient outcomes. However, when we redid this back in 2014, we saw 8.6% of all our MRSA bacteremias were PVL positive. So that's something to be concerned about. So essentially, our MRSA bacteremia is now much more diverse than it used to be, and we're seeing some ingress of some clones that are associated with poor outcomes. In terms of mortality, so this is 30-day all-cause mortality associated with MRSA bacteremia. You can see there's been a large reduction of the number of deaths following bacteremia infections. That's what you'd expect because we've seen a large reduction in the infections. The graph on the right-hand side is somewhat more interesting, which is the case fatality rate, which shows you the proportion of patients that die after 30 days. And this is all cause, so they're not necessarily dying of the MRSA. But you can see that there is a downward trend there in that case fatality rate. So that's good news. It means that not only are we seeing less infections due to MRSA, but when patients are catching these infections, more of them are surviving. On to CDI. So a very similar picture to MRSA. So throughout the 90s, we saw this large increase in Clostridium difficile infection. And we had a number of notable outbreaks. So in mid-2000, we start to see government action. They make the collection of this data mandatory. They start to put in targets. And then we see large reductions in the infections. There's a big push to control these infections. And then we see we're down to about 13,000 cases now. So if we look at that, some of the data from the mandatory reporting, you can see that large decline there. And here you can see the data split by trust apportioned, non-trust apportioned cases. So these are essentially your community onset and hospital onset cases. So you can see, again, as with MRSA, C. diff was mostly a trust apportioned, a hospital onset infection. And over time, we've seen it switch to being more of a community onset infection. And here you can see that broken down again with just a different look at the data. So it makes it more clear here. You can see the green proportion of the graph. I've got to hurry up. Increasing there. However, it's not clear-cut because obviously this community onset is only using, it is based on the 2-day rule and doesn't take into account whether those community cases were lost in hospital. So CDSC and ECDC have adopted a algorithm to look at that, and we traced our cases onto HES and looked at whether the patients had previously been in hospital. So with this algorithm, only those cases where the patient hasn't been in hospital for the last 12 weeks are viewed as true community cases, and that's the purple bar at the top. So it's a very small percentage of the cases. Your hospital onset cases are the blue cases. You can see those declining. But importantly, the community onset healthcare associated cases here, the sort of like mauve bars, are getting a lot bigger. So that's patients that have presented in the first 2 days of an admission, but they were in an acute trust within the last 4 weeks. And 80% of the time, it is the same acute trust that they were in as they have just been admitted to with their current C. diff infection. So that those community onset infections aren't particularly clear-cut, and they can often be healthcare associated as well. There is no guidance like this yet for the bacteremias, whereas there is with the C. diff, which is why we've done it. Again, with CDifficile, we've seen a change from O27 ribotype is the black bars, big hospital strain, associated with poorer patient outcomes, and the reductions have mostly been within the hospital onset cases. And again, you can see that strain associated with hospitals coming down over time, and now we're seeing a much more diverse picture. And again, with the CDI mortality, large reductions in deaths following C. difficile as the infection rates come down, but more importantly, the case fatality rate has also come down. So just with MRSA, more people that are getting CDI are surviving it. So to conclude, we saw a steady increase of these infections throughout the 90s and early noughties, but huge decreases post-2007. We've seen MRSA bacteremia change from a line-related infection to more skin soft tissue. We've seen community onset becoming increasingly important. As you can see from the C. diff data, that can be a bit of a grey area. And we've seen our strain distribution changing with both infections to be more diverse. But we've seen reductions in case fatality rates for both of the infections. Thank you very much.